The smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease had become so familiar to Maya Chen that she barely noticed it anymore as she pushed through the double doors of Rosie's diner at 5:30 in the morning, her third shift this week starting before the sun even considered rising. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that persistent electric hum that seemed to drill directly into her skull, and she could already see through the windows that the morning crowd was gathering outside, construction workers and taxi drivers and hospital staff, all waiting for their turn at one of the 12 cracked vinyl booths that made up the entirety of Rosie's customer seating. Maya tied her apron around her waist with practiced efficiency, her fingers moving through the motions while her mind was still half asleep, calculating in the back of her consciousness how many hours she'd managed to grab between her shift at the grocery store last night and this morning's opening, coming up with a depressing total of 3.5. That explained why her eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sandpaper. Rosie herself was already at the grill, a heavy-set woman in her 60s with arms like a longshoreman and a vocabulary that would make a sailor blush, flipping eggs with one hand while barking orders at the line cook with the other, and she shot Maya a look that communicated both sympathy and the clear message that sympathy wouldn't get the customers fed. The first wave hit at 6 o'clock sharp when Maya unlocked the front door and stepped aside as 24 people flooded in like water, breaking through a dam, each of them knowing exactly where they wanted to sit and exactly what they wanted to order, because most of them had been coming here for years, maybe decades, their routines as fixed as the rotation of the earth. Maya moved between tables with her notepad, scribbling down orders in the shorthand she'd developed over 2 years of working here: coffee black for the guy in the hard hat at table 3, scrambled eggs, and toast for the nurse still in scrubs at the counter, pancakes and sausage for the taxi driver who always left exactly 15% and not a penny more. Her feet already hurt and it wasn't even 7 yet. The cheap sneakers she'd bought at a discount store doing absolutely nothing to cushion the impact of concrete floors that seemed specifically designed to destroy human joints. Between orders she caught glimpses of herself in the chrome napkin dispensers, seeing a 24-year-old woman who looked closer to 35, her black hair pulled back in a ponytail that was starting to come loose, her brown eyes surrounded by shadows that no amount of concealer could hide, her uniform a size too big because she'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose when she'd been too busy working to remember to eat. The tips jar at the end of the counter was filling slowly, mostly with quarters and dollar bills, maybe enough to cover her electric bill if she was lucky and the universe decided to cut her a break for once. She thought about her mother's medical bill stacked up on the kitchen table of their one-bedroom apartment like a monument to everything that had gone wrong in the past 6 months. Numbers with so many zeros that they stopped looking like real money and started looking like some kind of cruel joke. The doctors said her mother needed surgery, the kind that insurance wouldn't cover, because of some clause buried in the fine print that Maya had never been able to fully understand. And every shift she worked was another few dollars toward a goal that seemed to move further away the closer she got to it. A plate crashed in the kitchen and Rosie's voice erupted in a string of profanity that made the construction workers look up with interest, and Maya grabbed 3 plates of breakfast from the window and delivered them to table 5 where a family with 2 young kids was already arguing about something in tired voices. The morning dragged on with that peculiar time distortion that happens when you're exhausted, minutes stretching like taffy while hours somehow vanished, and Maya's feet went from hurting to going numb, which was actually an improvement because at least numbness didn't actively hurt. She refilled coffee cups on autopilot, cleared plates, wiped down tables with a rag that smelled like industrial cleaner, and tried not to think about the fact that she had another shift at the grocery store tonight and then another opening shift here tomorrow morning, and somewhere in between she needed to visit her mother at the care facility and maybe, if the universe was feeling generous, sleep for more than 3 hours. The diner was finally starting to thin out around 9:30 when Maya noticed the commotion near the entrance, a cluster of customers standing and looking at something she couldn't quite see, their body language suggesting confusion or concern or maybe both. Maya pushed through the small crowd of onlookers to find an elderly woman sitting in booth 7, her hands moving in sharp, frustrated gestures, while a middle-aged man in a business suit stood nearby looking helpless and increasingly embarrassed, his mouth moving in exaggerated shapes as he tried to speak louder and slower like volume and speed was somehow the solution to whatever communication problem was happening here. The woman was probably in her 70s, Maya guessed, but one of those 70s where money and good genes and probably a personal trainer had kept age at bay more successfully than it managed for most people. Her silver hair cut in an elegant bob, her clothes, the kind of understated, expensive, that Maya had learned to recognize from years of serving people who had more money than she'd see in a lifetime. There was something about the way the woman's eyes were moving, darting around the diner with a particular kind of panic that Maya recognized from somewhere deep in her memory. And then she saw the hearing aid tucked behind the woman's left ear, and suddenly the pieces clicked into place with the clarity of a puzzle solving itself. The man in the suit was still trying to communicate, now attempting to pantomime something that looked like either coffee or possibly "I'm having a seizure." It was genuinely hard to tell, and the woman's frustration was building toward what looked like it might become tears, her hands still moving in those sharp gestures that Maya suddenly understood weren't just random movements but actual language, actual words being spoken in a way that most people in this diner wouldn't recognize. Maya felt something shift in her chest, some combination of recognition and memory, and the particular kind of anger that comes from watching someone struggle with something you know you can help with, and she stepped forward past the confused businessman and positioned herself where the elderly woman could see her clearly. Then, Maya lifted her hands and began to sign, her fingers forming shapes and movements that she hadn't used in almost 6 years, not since her younger brother had moved away to the deaf school in another state. But the language came back like riding a bicycle or swimming, something your body remembered, even when your conscious mind thought it had forgotten. "Hello," she signed, her movement slow and clear, and she watched the woman's eyes go wide with something that looked like shock and relief mixed together in equal measure. "My name is Maya. I can help you. What do you need?" The woman's entire body seemed to relax, her shoulders dropping from around her ears, her hands coming up to respond in ASL that was fluid and natural, and clearly her native language. "Oh, thank God," the woman signed, her movements quick with relief. "I've been trying to order for 10 minutes. This man is very nice, but he doesn't understand me." Maya felt a small smile tugging at her lips despite her exhaustion, and she turned to the businessman who was watching this exchange with his mouth slightly open. "She's deaf," Maya explained, saying the words that should have been obvious but apparently weren't to people who'd never had to think about it. "What were you trying to order?" she signed to the woman, her hands moving through the familiar shape. The elderly woman's face transformed with gratitude, and she signed back quickly, "Just coffee and toast, nothing complicated. But he kept asking me questions I couldn't understand and I couldn't explain, and people were staring." Maya nodded and turned to call the order back to Rose, who'd come out of the kitchen to see what the commotion was about, and within minutes the coffee was poured, and the toast was ordered, and the woman was settled in her booth with a smile that looked like someone had just handed her something precious. Maya should have gone back to her other tables, should have attended to the 3 other orders that were probably getting cold at the window, but instead she found herself lingering for just a moment, signing, "Is there anything else you need?" The woman looked up at her with eyes that were sharp and intelligent, and maybe a little watery with emotion, and she signed back, "You have no idea what it means to be understood. Most people don't even try." Maya felt something twist in her chest, remembering her brother in those early years before they'd found the right school, remembering the frustration and isolation, and the way people would treat him like he was invisible or stupid, just because he communicated differently. "I have some idea," Maya signed, and she saw recognition flash in the woman's eyes, the understanding that this wasn't just someone who'd learned ASL as a party trick or a college requirement, but someone who'd learned it because it mattered, because someone they loved needed them to. The moment stretched between them, something unspoken passing in the way that happens sometimes between strangers who recognize something in each other. And then Rosie's voice was calling Maya's name with increasing irritation, and she had to step away, back to the reality of other customers, and cold plates and the endless cycle of work that defined her existence. The morning rush finally ended around 10:30, leaving the diner in that strange lull that happened between breakfast and lunch, when the only customers were retirees nursing coffee and construction workers on late breaks, and Maya found herself gravitating back to booth 7, where the elderly woman was still sitting, her coffee half finished, her toast barely touched, her eyes watching the diner with the kind of careful observation that suggested she was used to being on the outside looking in. Maya knew she should be using this quiet time to prep for lunch, to refill salt shakers and ketchup bottles, and do all the mindless tasks that kept a diner running, but instead she found herself sliding into the booth, across from the woman, her tired body, grateful for even a few minutes off her feet. "Slow morning," the woman signed with a slight smile, and Maya nodded, signing back. "It gets busier for lunch. Are you visiting the area?" The conversation started like that, small talk translated through moving hands instead of moving lips, but somehow it felt more intimate than regular conversation, maybe because sign language required you to look directly at the person you were talking to, required full attention in a way that spoken words didn't always demand. The woman's name was Eleanor, she learned, and she was indeed visiting from upstate, staying at one of the expensive hotels near the waterfront while she handled some business in the city, though she didn't specify what kind of business, and Maya didn't ask because you learned early in the service industry not to pry into customers' lives beyond polite small talk. Eleanor asked about Maya's signing, where she'd learned it, and Maya found herself explaining about her brother Marcus, about those difficult early years before they'd understood what being deaf meant and how to support him, about learning ASL as a family and how it had changed everything, giving Marcus a way to express himself and them a way to truly understand him. "He's at a school for the deaf now," Maya signed, trying to keep the sadness out of her movements but knowing it probably showed anyway. "He loves it there. It's the first place he's felt like he truly belonged." Eleanor's expression softened with understanding, and she signed back. "I went to a school like that. It saved my life. Before that, my family tried to make me speak, to read lips, to be normal." She made the sign for normal with a twist that conveyed all the complicated feelings wrapped up in that word. "But I was never meant to be normal. I was meant to be deaf. There's a difference." Maya felt something click in her understanding. The way Eleanor's earlier panic made even more sense now. The isolation of being in a world that wasn't built for you and rarely made accommodations. And she signed, "I'm sorry about earlier, about how my manager and that customer didn't know how to help. They meant well." But Eleanor waved a hand dismissively, signing, "Don't apologize for them. I've dealt with it my whole life. You'd be surprised how many people think deafness is a problem to be solved, rather than just a different way of being." They talked for another 10 minutes, and Maya learned that Eleanor had grown up in an era when deaf education was completely different, when mainstreaming wasn't even an option, and sign language was sometimes actively discouraged in favor of forcing deaf children to speak, a practice that Eleanor described with movements that were still angry even after all these years. She learned that Eleanor had gone on to college despite people telling her it would be impossible, had built a successful career though the details remained vague, had raised a family and lived a full life while constantly battling against systems and attitudes that treated her deafness as a limitation rather than just a characteristic. Maya found herself opening up in return, talking about her mother's illness, about the medical bills and the multiple jobs and the constant exhaustion that had become her normal, and Eleanor watched her with eyes that seemed to see more than Maya was saying, understanding perhaps what it meant to carry weight that other people couldn't see. "You're very young to have so much responsibility," Eleanor signed, her movements gentle with concern, and Maya shrugged, signing back, "I'm 24, not that young." But Eleanor shook her head, signing, 24 is very young to be raising a family alone, working yourself to exhaustion, sacrificing everything for someone else. Where is your father, your brother?" Maya felt her hands falter, the signs coming slower as she explained that her father had left when Marcus was diagnosed, unable to handle having a deaf son, unable to handle the extra work and expense and difference, and that Marcus was at his school, which was the best place for him, even though she missed him desperately, and that there was no one else, just her and her mother, and the weight of keeping them both alive. Eleanor reached across the table and took Maya's hands in hers, not signing now but just holding them, and Maya felt something break loose in her chest, some dam that had been holding back everything she didn't have time to feel, and for just a moment in that quiet diner booth she let herself be seen in all her exhaustion and fear and desperate determination. Maya was wiping down a nearby table when the man walked in, and she knew immediately that he didn't belong in Rosie's diner, the same way a Rolls-Royce doesn't belong in a Walmart parking lot. Everything about him, from his tailored suit that probably cost more than Maya's annual rent to his expensive watch, to the way he carried himself screaming money, and power, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about whether you could afford toast. He paused just inside the door, his eyes scanning the diner with barely concealed anxiety, and then his gaze landed on Eleanor in booth 7 and his entire body relaxed with visible relief, his expression shifting from worry to something like exasperation mixed with affection. He crossed the diner in quick strides, ignoring the stares from the other customers who were all doing the same calculation Maya had done, and coming up with the same conclusion that this man was very much not their usual clientele. And when he reached Eleanor's booth, his mouth was already moving in what looked like it was going to be a lecture about something. Eleanor looked up at him with an expression that was pure maternal patience, the kind that transcended hearing or deafness or any other characteristic, and then she glanced at Maya and signed something that made the man stop mid-sentence and turn to look at the waitress he'd probably barely registered as human until that moment. Maya felt suddenly self-conscious about her stained apron and her loose ponytail and the fact that she probably smelled like coffee and cleaning supplies, but she met his gaze steadily, because she'd learned a long time ago that rich people put their pants on one leg at a time just like everyone else, even if their pants cost $1,000. The man's expression shifted again, something like surprise followed by reassessment, and he looked back at Eleanor and said something that Maya couldn't hear from where she was standing, but based on Eleanor's responding signs was probably asking how they'd communicated. Eleanor's hands moved in a fluid explanation, pointing to Maya, demonstrating some signs, and the man's eyebrows rose incrementally higher with each gesture, until he looked like he might actually be impressed, which for a man who clearly didn't impress easily was saying something. He turned back to Maya and spoke directly to her this time, his voice cultured and careful in the way of people who'd learned to speak multiple languages. "My mother tells me you were very kind to her this morning, that you helped her when no one else understood what she needed." Maya felt her face warm slightly, uncomfortable with praise from someone who looked like he could buy and sell her life 100 times over. "It wasn't a big deal. I just know sign language." Her order was simple, but the man shook his head, his expression serious now. "You'd be surprised how many people wouldn't bother. Most hearing people see a deaf person struggling, and they either ignore them or they get frustrated as if the deafness is some kind of personal inconvenience being inflicted on them, deliberately." He glanced at Eleanor with obvious affection. "My mother is perfectly capable of handling herself, but it's rare that someone meets her where she is instead of expecting her to adapt to them." Eleanor was signing something else now, her movements quick and emphatic, and the man watched her hands and then looked back at Maya with an expression that suggested he was making some kind of decision. "My mother would like to give you something as thanks, a tip for your excellent service." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a wallet that was probably worth more than everything Maya currently owned combined, and Maya felt herself instinctively step back, shaking her head. "That's really not necessary. I was just doing my job." She already paid for her meal. But Eleanor was signing again, her movements insistent, and the man translated. "She says you didn't just do your job, you saw her. You understood. That's worth something." He pulled out what looked like a business card and held it out to Maya, who took it automatically, her tired brain not quite processing what was happening. The card was thick and expensive, cream-colored with raised lettering that spelled out Whitmore Industries and below that James Whitmore CEO and a phone number. Maya's exhausted mind tried to place why that name sounded familiar, something tickling at the edge of her consciousness about Whitmore Industries, something she'd seen in the news or heard mentioned somewhere, something big. James Whitmore was watching her with an expression that suggested he was used to people recognizing his name and was waiting patiently for the penny to drop, and Eleanor was watching too, her eyes bright with something that might have been amusement or anticipation, or maybe both. "I don't understand," Maya said, her voice coming out smaller than she intended, and James smiled slightly. "My mother has a gift for recognizing quality in people. She's rarely wrong. She'd like to offer you a position if you're interested." The words didn't make sense strung together like that, didn't form a coherent meaning in Maya's overtired brain, and she looked down at the business card in her hand and then back up at this impossibly wealthy man and his deaf mother who was still smiling at her from the booth. "A position doing what?" Maya asked, and even as she said it her mind was supplying information it had been too tired to access before, articles she'd skimmed while waiting for her laundry at the laundromat, Headlines about Whitmore Industries being one of the largest tech companies in the country, about their young CEO who'd taken over from his father and revolutionized their approach to accessibility technology, about their headquarters being right here in the city and their reputation for innovation and their stock price that made investors weep with joy. Maya stood there holding the business card like it might explode, her mind racing through calculations and possibilities and the overwhelming sense that this had to be some kind of joke or mistake or fever dream brought on by too many consecutive shifts on too little sleep, because things like this didn't happen to people like her, to exhausted waitresses who could barely pay their electric bills, much less. Imagine working for one of the largest tech companies in the country. James Whitmore was still watching her with that patient expression, and Eleanor was signing something that James translated without looking away from Maya's face. My mother wants you to know that this isn't charity. She doesn't believe in charity. She believes in recognizing talent and potential and giving people opportunities they've earned through their character. Maya felt her hands trembling slightly and she tucked them behind her back so no one would notice, trying to organize her thoughts into something coherent enough to speak out loud. I'm just a waitress. I don't have any tech experience. I barely made it through community college. I don't understand what you think I could do at your company. But James was already shaking his head, and Eleanor was signing again, her movements emphatic enough that Maya could almost understand them, even though she wasn't looking directly at her. We're not offering you a tech position, James explained, his voice patient. At least not initially. What my mother is suggesting is that you join our accessibility consulting division. We've been expanding our services for deaf and hard of hearing clients, developing new products and interfaces, but we need people who actually understand the deaf community, not just developers who studied accessibility as an abstract concept in school. He gestured toward Eleanor. My mother has been consulting for us for the past 5 years, helping us understand what deaf users actually need versus what hearing developers think they need, and the difference has been revolutionary for our product. But she's one person, and she's been saying for months that we need to bring in more voices, more perspectives, particularly younger people who can bridge both the deaf and hearing worlds. Maya felt like her brain was short-circuiting, trying to process too much information at once while running on 3 hours of sleep and pure caffeine. I'm not deaf, my brother is deaf, but I'm hearing. I learned sign language to communicate with him, that's all. Eleanor was signing again, and this time Maya caught enough of it to understand before James translated. That's exactly the point. You're fluent in both languages, both cultures. You can communicate with our deaf employees and clients with full fluency, but you can also interface with the hearing world of our business operations. That's incredibly valuable. James pulled out his phone and typed something quickly, then showed the screen to Maya. It was a job post, she realized, for a position titled Accessibility Consultant and Community Liaison, with a salary that made Maya's vision blur slightly, because it was more than she currently made at both her jobs combined, more than she'd ever imagined making at any point in her foreseeable future, more than enough to cover her mother's medical bills and rent, and maybe even some left over for things like food that wasn't ramen noodles or sleep that wasn't measured in minutes, snatched between shifts. This is the position my mother is recommending you for, James said quiet. Obviously there would be an interview process, a proper hiring procedure. We're a serious company and we do things properly, but if you're interested, I can personally ensure that your application goes to the top of the pile and gets serious consideration. Maya looked down at the job description, her eyes scanning words like competitive salary and full benefits and opportunities for advancement and flexible scheduling, and felt something dangerous starting to bloom in her chest, something that felt like hope, which was the most terrifying emotion of all, because hope required you to believe that things could be different, could be better, and she'd spent so long just surviving that she'd forgotten what it felt like to imagine actually thriving. She looked up at Eleanor, who was watching her with eyes that seemed to understand exactly what was happening in Maya's head, the war between desperate want and the fear of disappointment and the sheer exhaustion that made it hard to believe in anything good. Why? Maya signed directly to Eleanor, cutting out the translator, wanting to understand this woman to woman, without her son as intermediary. You don't know me. I served you coffee and toast. That's it. How can you possibly know I'd be good at this? Eleanor's face softened with something that looked like recognition, and she signed back slowly, deliberately, making sure Maya caught every word. Because I watched how you moved through this diner. I watched you handle every customer with patience even though you were clearly exhausted. I watched you notice me struggling before anyone else did, and I watched you help without making me feel like a burden or a problem to be solved. That's not something you can teach someone. That's character. That's empathy. That's exactly what we need. Maya felt her eyes burning with tears. Absolutely could not afford to cry in the middle of her shift in front of customers and her boss and these impossibly wealthy people who were offering her something that felt like a life raft thrown to someone who'd been drowning for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe. Rosie's voice cut through the moment like a knife through butter, calling Maya's name with the particular edge that meant lunch crowd was starting and she needed to get back to work immediately. And Maya looked toward the kitchen and then back at James and Eleanor, her hand still clutching that business card like it was the only solid thing in a tilting world. Maya finished her shift in a daze, moving through the familiar motions of taking orders and delivering food and clearing tables while her mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying the conversation with Eleanor and James Whitmore over and over like a song stuck on repeat, trying to find the catch or the trick, or the moment where this obvious fantasy would reveal itself to be exactly that. She'd tucked the business card into her apron pocket and felt it there all afternoon like it was burning a hole through the fabric, a small rectangle of expensive paper stock that represented the possibility of everything she'd been too tired to even dream about anymore. When her shift finally ended at 3 o'clock, she walked home through streets she'd walked hundreds of times before, past the bodega where she bought her groceries on credit when money was particularly tight, past the laundromat where she spent Sunday mornings doing clothes in machines that ate quarters like they were starving, past the building with the broken buzzer where Mrs. Rodriguez sold tamales out of her apartment on weekends. Maya climbed the 4 flights to her apartment because the elevator had been broken since July, and the landlord kept promising to fix it next month, a promise that had now rolled over 3 times with no sign of actual repair, and she let herself into the 1-bedroom apartment she shared with her mother, or had shared before her mother's condition had gotten bad enough to require round-the-clock care at a facility that ate through their savings like termites through wood. The apartment was quiet and stuffy. The afternoon heat trapped in the walls because air conditioning was a luxury they couldn't afford, and opening windows just let in the noise and smell of the city. And Maya dropped her bag on the kitchen counter next to the stack of medical bills that never seemed to get smaller, no matter how many payments she made. She pulled out the business card and stared at it under the harsh fluorescent kitchen light, half expecting it to have transformed into something else or disappeared entirely. But it was still there, still real, cream-colored cardstock with raised lettering that probably cost more per card than Maya spent on groceries in a week. She thought about her mother at the care facility, about visiting her last night and finding her confused again, not recognizing Maya for a full 10 minutes before clarity returned to her eyes with that heartbreaking moment of awareness where she realized she'd been lost. She thought about Marcus at his school upstate, about the last video call they'd had where he'd been so excited about his classes and his friends and finally being somewhere he felt understood, and about how she hadn't been able to visit him in person in 4 months because she couldn't afford the time off work or the bus fare. She thought about the conversation she'd had with the hospital billing department last week, about the woman on the phone explaining in a tone that was probably meant to be sympathetic but came across as condescending that they really needed to work out a payment plan that involved more than $20 a month if they ever wanted to actually make progress on the debt. Maya sat down at the kitchen table and pulled out her phone. The screen cracked from when she'd dropped it 3 months ago and couldn't afford to fix, and she looked up Whitmore Industries with fingers that trembled slightly from exhaustion or hope or fear or some combination of all three. The website was sleek and professional, showing photos of their headquarters which looked like something from a science fiction movie, all glass and steel and open spaces flooded with natural light, so different from the fluorescent lit boxes where Maya had spent most of her working life that it might as well have been on another planet. She clicked through to their accessibility division and found herself looking at page after page of technology designed for deaf and hard of hearing use, innovations in visual communication and sign language recognition software and devices that translated speech to text in real time, and woven through all of it were testimonials from deaf users, talking about how these products had changed their life, had made them feel seen and understood in a world that was built for hearing people. There were photos of the team too, and Maya found herself scanning faces looking for Eleanor and finding her there in multiple pictures, standing with groups of employees, or demonstrating something to a room full of people, or sitting at a conference table in what was clearly a high-level meeting. And in every single photo she looked confident and competent and completely in her element in a way that Maya had never felt anywhere in her entire life. She found articles about James Whitmore too, profiles in business magazines and tech publications that painted a picture of a CEO who'd taken over his family's company and transformed it from a traditional manufacturing business into a tech giant focused on accessibility and inclusive design, who credited his mother's influence with changing his entire perspective on what technology should do and who it should serve. One article mentioned that Eleanor had been instrumental in pushing the company to hire more deaf employees, to create an entire division run by and for the deaf community, to treat accessibility not as an afterthought or a compliance issue, but as a core value that drove innovation. Maya sat back in her chair, the phone still in her hand, and tried to imagine herself in those sleek offices, working on projects that actually mattered, making enough money to properly take care of her mother and visit her brother, and maybe, possibly have something left over for her for things like hobbies or rest or a future that extended beyond the next shift and the next bill and the next crisis. It felt impossible and terrifying, and she realized with sudden clarity that she was more afraid of this opportunity than she was of anything else that had happened to her in years, more afraid of the possibility of success than she'd ever been of continued failure, because failure was familiar and she knew how to survive it, but success was unknown territory where she had no map. Maya called the number on the business card 3 days later, after she'd worked 2 more shifts at the diner and 1 at the grocery store, and had visited her mother, who'd been having a good day, lucid and asking about Maya's life in that way that made her want to lie about how hard everything was because her mother had enough to worry about, without adding her daughter's exhaustion to the list. The woman who answered the phone had a professional voice that somehow managed to be warm and efficient at the same time, and when Maya explained who she was and why she was calling, there was a brief pause, and then the woman said in a tone of clear recognition, "Oh yes, Miss Chen, we've been expecting your call. Mr. Whitmore left specific instructions. Can you come in for an interview tomorrow at 10? Maya's heart hammered in her chest as she mentally calculated her schedule, the shift she'd have to call out of, the money she'd lose from not working, the risk she'd be taking by treating this like it was real instead of just a fever dream that would evaporate under scrutiny. Yes, she heard herself say, tomorrow at 10 works. She spent that evening going through her closet, looking for something appropriate to wear to interview at a tech company, a task that was complicated by the fact that her wardrobe consisted primarily of jeans and t-shirts, and her diner uniform, and absolutely nothing that could be considered professional by any stretch of the imagination. She finally settled on a pair of black slacks she'd worn to her community college graduation 3 years ago, and a white button-down shirt she'd thrifted for a job interview that hadn't panned out, and she spent an hour ironing out wrinkles and hoping that clean and neat would be enough to compensate for not expensive. The Whitmore Industries building was in the part of the city where Maya rarely ventured, where the streets were cleaner, and the buildings were newer, and every person she passed on the sidewalk looked like they belonged in a completely different economic bracket than she did, their clothes tailored and their briefcases expensive, and their phones the latest models rather than 3-year-old devices with cracked screens. She found the building easily enough, a tower of glass and steel that seemed to stretch toward the sky with the kind of architectural ambition that said money was no object, and she stood outside for a full 3 minutes, trying to gather the courage to actually walk through the revolving doors into the marble lobby where a security guard sat at a desk that probably cost more than her rent. The guard directed her to the elevators with a professionally friendly smile, and Maya rode up to the 15th floor, watching the city drop away below her through the glass walls, each floor passing by with digital precision, until the doors opened onto a reception area that looked like something from a magazine about future offices, all clean lines and natural light, and plants that were probably real and cost more to maintain than Maya made in a month. The receptionist checked her in with the same warm efficiency as the woman on the phone had displayed, and within 5 minutes Maya found herself being led down a hallway lined with glass-walled conference rooms and open office spaces where people worked at standing desks and sat on exercise balls, and seemed to be engaged in the kind of productive creativity that came from actually enjoying your job, a concept so foreign to Maya's experience that it might as well have been science fiction. The conference room where they directed her had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and a table that could seat 12 people but currently held only 4. And as Maya stepped through the door, she saw Eleanor Whitmore at the head of the table, looking exactly as composed and elegant as she had in the diner, and next to her was James Whitmore in another expensive suit, and two other people she didn't recognize, but who introduced themselves as Sarah Chen, head of HR, and David Martinez, director of the accessibility division. Maya sat down in the chair they indicated, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking, and Eleanor immediately began signing a greeting that was warm and encouraging, and Maya felt some of her tension ease slightly because at least here was one person who already believed she belonged in this room. The interview started formally, with Sarah asking standard questions about her work history and her education, and her experience with sign language, and Maya answered as honestly as she could, explaining that her formal education had ended with an associate's degree because she'd run out of money and time, that her work experience consisted primarily of service industry jobs, that her ASL fluency came from growing up with a deaf brother, and being part of the deaf community in that peripheral way that hearing family members often were, never fully inside but never completely outside either. David Martinez asked her about specific signs and regional variations in ASL, testing her fluency in a way that felt more curious than adversarial, and Maya found herself relaxing into the conversation because this was something she actually knew, something she'd lived rather than just studied, and she could see him nodding with approval as she explained the difference between formal ASL and the more casual signing that happened within families and friend groups. Then Eleanor began signing questions directly to Maya, cutting out the verbal translation entirely, and Maya understood with sudden clarity that this was the real test, whether she could handle a professional conversation entirely in ASL, whether her fluency was just conversational or actually functional in a business context. Eleanor asked her about challenges she'd observed in her brother's experience navigating a hearing world, about times when accessibility had been lacking or could have been improved, about what she thought deaf users needed most from technology companies that claimed to serve them. Maya's hands moved through her responses with increasing confidence, explaining how Marcus had struggled in mainstream schools, where accommodations were treated as burdens rather than necessity, how he'd flourished once he was in an environment designed for deaf students rather than adapted for them as an afterthought, how the deaf community often felt like technology was developed at them rather than with them, solutions imposed by hearing developers who'd never actually consulted the people they claimed to be helping. She watched Eleanor's face light up with recognition and approval, and James was watching too, his expression suggesting he was seeing something he liked, and Sarah was taking notes with the focused attention of someone who was already thinking about next steps rather than whether to move forward. The interview lasted an hour, and by the end of it, Maya felt wrung out but also strangely energized in a way she hadn't felt in years, the kind of tired that came from actually using your brain for something beyond just survival calculation. And when they thanked her for coming and said they'd be in touch soon, she believed them in a way that surprised her because she'd trained herself not to believe in good things anymore as a protection against disappointment. The call came 2 days later while Maya was in the middle of her shift at the diner, her phone buzzing in her apron pocket, with an unfamiliar number that she almost didn't answer because telemarketers had become increasingly aggressive lately, and she didn't have time to tell someone she wasn't interested in extended car warranties. But something made her step into the back alley, where she could hear over the noise of the kitchen, and Sarah Chen's voice came through the speaker, clear and professional, saying words that Maya had to ask her to repeat, because they didn't make sense the first time, something about offering her the position, and when could she start, and details about salary and benefits that Sarah rattled off like they were normal numbers, rather than amounts that represented more financial security than Maya had ever experienced in her entire life. Maya stood in that alley between two dumpsters, the smell of rotting food and car exhaust heavy in the air, and felt tears running down her face as she accepted the job in a voice that shook with emotions she couldn't even name, some combination of relief and disbelief and gratitude so overwhelming it felt like it might crack her ribs, and she leaned against the brick wall trying to catch her breath while her mind raced through immediate calculations about giving notice and finding professional clothes, and figuring out how to navigate a world she'd only ever observed from the outside. She gave her 2 weeks' notice at both jobs that same day, and both her managers reacted with the kind of resignation that suggested they'd always known she was too smart to stay stuck in those positions forever, and Rosie even hugged her, which was unprecedented and slightly uncomfortable, given that Rosie had never been the hugging type, but Maya understood it was her way of saying she was proud even if she couldn't find the actual words. The last 2 weeks at the diner passed in a strange blur where everything felt both familiar and alien at the same time, her hands moving through the same motions they'd performed thousands of times while her mind was already somewhere else, imagining the office she'd work in, and the project she'd contribute to, and the life that was waiting just beyond these final shifts. Her regular customers noticed something different about her, some lightness in her step or brightness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, and a few of them asked what had changed, and when she told them she was leaving for a better job, they offered congratulations with genuine warmth that reminded her that even in this exhausting place there had been moments of human connection worth remembering. Her first day at Whitmore Industries felt like stepping into an alternate universe where work didn't have to mean exhaustion and exploitation, where her bathroom breaks weren't timed and her lunch was actually a full hour, and the break room had free coffee that didn't taste like battery acid and fruit, that was actually fresh rather than on the edge of turning, and she kept waiting for someone to tell her there had been a mistake, that she didn't actually belong here, that they'd confused her with someone more qualified. Eleanor met her in the lobby personally, signing greetings and introductions as she led Maya through the building, and Maya realized with growing amazement that at least a third of the employees she passed were deaf, communicating in ASL with the same casual fluency that hearing people used spoken English, and the hearing employees all knew at least basic signs so that conversations flowed seamlessly between languages, without the awkward pauses and confusion that usually marked such interactions. Her desk was in an open office space with windows that let in actual sunlight, a concept so novel after years of fluorescent lighting, that she found herself just standing there for a moment, soaking it in like a plant that had been kept in a closet, and her computer setup included specialized software for video calls with ASL interpretation and captioning, and someone had left a welcome basket on her desk with a coffee mug that said Accessibility Champion and snacks that were actually good quality rather than the stale vending machine offerings she'd survived on for years. Her first week was spent in training sessions that covered everything from company culture to their current projects to the technical specifications of the accessibility tools they were developing, and Maya absorbed it all with the desperate focus of someone who'd been starving for intellectual stimulation and was finally being fed, taking notes until her hand cramped and asking questions that her trainers seemed delighted to answer rather than annoyed by. David Martinez became her direct supervisor, and turned out to be hearing but with deaf parents, which meant he understood both worlds with the same kind of dual fluency Maya had, and he threw her into projects immediately with the kind of confidence that suggested he believed she could handle it, assigning her to consult on a new app designed to help deaf users navigate public transportation systems with real-time visual alerts and sign language instructions. Maya found herself in meetings with developers and designers and other consultants, many of them deaf, all of them passionate about creating technology that actually served the community rather than just checking accessibility boxes for compliance purposes, and she discovered that she had opinions about these things, strong opinions based on years of watching Marcus struggle with tools that were poorly designed or implemented as afterthoughts, and people actually listened when she spoke or actually valued her input in a way that felt revolutionary. After years of being treated as interchangeable with any other service worker, the salary meant she could move her mother to a better care facility within the first month, one where the staff actually seemed to care about their patients as people rather than just bodies to process through their shifts, where her mother had her own room with a window and activities designed to keep her mind engaged even as her memory became increasingly unreliable, and watching her mother settle into that space with genuine comfort rather than the resigned tolerance she'd shown at the previous facility made Maya cry in the parking lot, with relief that felt like releasing pressure that had been building for years. 6 months into working at Whitmore Industries, Maya had transformed from the exhausted waitress who could barely keep her eyes open during shifts into someone who actually looked forward to Monday mornings, who woke up with energy instead of dread, who felt purpose driving her forward instead of just survival instinct keeping her moving. It meant she could visit Marcus more often, taking the bus upstate on weekends and spending whole days with him instead of snatched hours between shifts, watching him thrive in his environment and feeling the guilt that had weighted her chest for months finally starting to lift because she was no longer failing him by being too broke and too tired to be present in his life. Marcus noticed the change in her immediately during their first long visit after she'd started the new job, signing with excitement about how different she seemed, how she wasn't falling asleep during their conversations anymore, how she actually had stories to tell about her work that weren't just complaints about difficult customers or unfair managers, and she realized that she'd been so ground down by poverty and exhaustion that even the people who loved her had adjusted their expectations downward, had accepted her diminished state as normal rather than temporary. She could afford an apartment now with working heat and an elevator that actually functioned and a bathroom where the plumbing didn't make concerning noises, and moving her few possessions from the old place to the new one felt like shedding a skin she'd outgrown, leaving behind the physical manifestation of struggle and stepping into a space that reflected possibility instead of limitation. She could buy groceries without calculating every purchase down to the penny, could replace her cracked phone screen, could own more than 2 pairs of work-appropriate pants, could do laundry in her own building instead of spending Sunday mornings at the laundromat, and each of these small material improvements accumulated into a quality of life she'd forgotten was even possible when you weren't rich, just comfortable enough that basic survival didn't consume every thought and action. But more than the money, more than the material improvements that had stabilized her life, what transformed Maya was the sense of purpose that came from work that actually mattered, from using her skills and her experiences to make things better for people like her brother, for people like Eleanor, for the entire deaf community that had been such a part of her life even though she herself was hearing. She developed a reputation within the company as someone who would push back when designs didn't serve users well, who would advocate fiercely for features that developers wanted to skip because they were complicated or expensive, who understood that accessibility wasn't a feature to be added, but a fundamental requirement that should shape every decision from the beginning. And her willingness to fight for these principles earned her respect from colleagues who'd seen too many consultants roll over when executives pushed back on recommendations that would cost time or money. Eleanor became not just the woman who'd changed her life but a mentor and friend, someone who taught Maya about navigating corporate politics and advocating for change within systems that resisted it and maintaining your integrity even when it would be easier to compromise. And their relationship evolved beyond professional collaboration into genuine affection, built on shared values and mutual respect and the recognition of something in each other that transcended the differences in their backgrounds and ages. They had lunch together at least once a week, sometimes in the company cafeteria and sometimes at restaurants Eleanor chose, places Maya never would have entered before because they seemed designed for people with different bank accounts and different lives. And Eleanor would ask about Marcus and Maya's mother and listen with the kind of attention that made Maya feel seen in ways that went beyond just being heard. The accessibility projects Maya worked on started showing real results and devices, launching with features that the deaf community actually praised rather than tolerated, and she'd get messages from Marcus or his friends at the deaf school saying they'd tried something Whitmore Industries had released and it actually worked the way they needed it to work. It actually felt like it had been designed for them rather than at them, and those moments of validation made all the long hours and difficult meetings worth it, because she could see the direct line between her work and improved lives. 6 months into the job, David Martinez called her into his office and told her she was being promoted to senior consultant with a raise that made her laugh out loud when she saw the offer letter because it was absurd how much her life had changed in such a short time, from scraping by on tips and minimum wage, to making more than her mother had ever earned in her best year working as a nurse before her illness. And the imposter syndrome that had plagued her those first few months was finally starting to fade as she realized that she'd earned this through her work and her insights and her willingness to push for excellence rather than just good enough. She started speaking up more in meetings, offering ideas that went beyond just critiquing existing proposals to suggesting entirely new directions the company could explore. And people listened because she'd proven herself competent and because she brought a perspective that complemented rather than duplicated the expertise of developers and designers who'd been doing this work for years without her particular combination of lived experience and emerging professional knowledge. Eleanor encouraged her to consider going back to school to pursue formal education in human-computer interaction or accessibility design. not because she needed credentials to prove she knew what she was talking about, but because the theoretical frameworks and research methodologies she'd learned would give her new tools for the work she was already doing, would let her contribute to the academic discourse that shaped industry practices, would position her to influence the field at levels beyond just her own company's product. A year after that morning in the diner, when Eleanor Whitmore had walked into Maya Chen's life like fate, disguised as a customer, ordering coffee and toast, Maya found herself standing on a stage at Tech Forward, one of the largest technology conferences in the country, with Eleanor beside her, and an audience of over 800 developers, designers, executives, and accessibility advocates watching them prepare to present their keynote on authentic accessibility consulting and the critical importance of including disabled voices in technology development from the ground up, rather than treating accessibility as an afterthought or a compliance checkbox. Maya wore a tailored suit she'd purchased with her own salary, charcoal grey with a silk blouse underneath, professional and polished in a way that would have been unimaginable to the exhausted waitress she'd been just 12 months ago, and she looked out at the sea of faces in the auditorium and felt only the tiniest flutter of nerves, because she knew exactly what she was talking about, knew it from lived experience and professional expertise, and a full year of work that had taught her she absolutely belonged in rooms like this, regardless of what her background suggested to people who measured worth by credentials instead of character. Eleanor stood beside her in an elegant blue dress that complemented her silver hair, and Maya watched as she signed the opening remarks to the audience, her movements fluid and confident, 70-plus years of refusing to let the world diminish her evident in every gesture, and Maya interpreted aloud for the hearing members of the audience, her voice steady and clear, as she explained how they'd met in that diner, how a simple act of communication had sparked a partnership that had transformed not just Maya's personal life but had influenced multiple product lines at Whitmore Industries and was now serving as a model for how tech companies could and should engage with the communities they claimed to serve, rather than just extracting data and insights without genuine collaboration or compensation. They walked the audience through specific projects showing before and after designs that illustrated exactly how deaf consultation had improved products that hearing developers had thought were already accessible, demonstrating with concrete examples how assumptions made by people outside a community consistently failed to address actual needs in favor of imagined ones, explaining the difference between compliance with legal standards and actual usability that served people's lives. Maya shared stories from Marcus with his explicit permission, talking about educational apps that had frustrated him with their hearing-centric design assumptions until Whitmore Industries had consulted with actual deaf students and teachers and rebuilt the interfaces from scratch. And she saw people in the audience nodding with recognition, some of them signing to each other in ASL, the deaf community present and visible in this space in a way that was still too rare at mainstream tech conferences. The question and answer sessions stretched longer than scheduled because people kept raising hands with thoughtful questions about implementation and budget considerations, and how to build genuine relationships with disabled communities instead of just conducting extractive research. And both Maya and Eleanor responded with patience and detail, refusing to oversimplify the work while also insisting it was absolutely possible if companies actually committed resources and respect to the process. After the presentation ended and they'd finally extracted themselves from the crowd that had gathered around the stage asking follow-up questions and sharing their own experience, Eleanor pulled Maya into a quiet corner of the conference center and signed with movements that were personal rather than professional, telling her how proud she was of how far Maya had come, how she'd known from that first morning that Maya possessed something special that couldn't be taught in any classroom or training program, some fundamental combination of empathy and intelligence and fierce determination to make things better that was exactly what the field needed. Maya signed back that she owed Eleanor everything, but Eleanor's response was emphatic as she insisted that debt was the wrong framework for understanding what had happened between them, that Maya had earned every single opportunity through her own merit and hard work, that all Eleanor had done was recognize potential that was already there and help create space for it to flourish, that the transformation had been Maya's own achievement and no one could take that away from her or diminish it by attributing it to someone else's generosity. That evening Maya visited her mother at the significantly better care facility she could now afford, bringing dinner from a restaurant her mother had loved before the illness, and they sat together in the comfortable room with the window overlooking a small garden. And Maya told her about the conference and the presentation and the standing ovation they'd received, and how impossibly far she'd traveled from the version of herself who'd been working 3 jobs and drowning in medical bills just 12 months ago. Her mother's memory was increasingly unreliable now, the progressive nature of her condition evident in how she sometimes forgot conversations they'd just had or confused past and present. But in that moment she was fully present and loose, looking at Maya with eyes that shone with maternal pride and saying in a voice that trembled with emotion that she'd always known her daughter was destined for extraordinary things, even when circumstances had made that destiny seem impossible. Maya held her mother's hand and felt tears sliding down her cheeks, grateful tears for the chance to provide comfort and security in return for all the years her mother had sacrificed to raise 2 children alone after their father had abandoned them. Grateful for the opportunity to give back even a fraction of what she'd received, grateful that her mother was still here to see this transformation even as the disease slowly took her away. The next morning Maya woke in her apartment that had become a home, sunlight streaming through windows that looked out over the city she'd always lived in, but was only now beginning to truly experience beyond the grind of survival, and she got ready for work with anticipation rather than dread, actually looking forward to the projects on her desk and the collaborative meetings with colleagues she genuinely respected, and the knowledge that her contributions mattered in concrete ways that improved real people's lives. She stopped for coffee at a shop near her office, and while waiting for her order she noticed a young deaf man trying to communicate with the barista through gestures that weren't being understood, frustration building on both sides of the interaction. In that familiar way Maya had witnessed countless times, and she stepped forward and signed an offer to help, watching his expression shift from frustration to relief to gratitude as she interpreted his order, and then stayed long enough to make sure he got exactly what he wanted. And as she walked away she caught his signed thank you and responded with a simple "of course" in ASL, and the awareness that this was the cycle Eleanor had started. Connection building on connection, understanding spreading through small moments of recognition that accumulated into cultural change, one interaction at a time, and Maya understood with perfect clarity that she was now part of that ripple effect, carrying forward the gift she'd been given by extending it to others, creating pathways where none had existed, opening doors for people who'd been told those doors weren't meant for them, proving through her own transformation that opportunity and recognition and genuine human connection had the power to change everything.